The great hall of Aethelgard was a tomb of jagged stone and freezing silence, save for the rhythmic, wet thud of the High Alpha's signet ring against Marin's jaw. She did not cry out. She simply tilted her head, catching the copper-tasting blood in her mouth as she knelt upon the rushes. Beside the Alpha stood Lord Mordecai, the man who, only a week ago, had promised her a life beyond the kitchens. Now, he looked through her as if she were made of glass, his hand possessively resting on the shoulder of the true heir. "Look at this thing," the Alpha commanded, his voice a low, guttering flame of institutional spite, a Commonborn stray that thought she could mimic the scent of nobility. He reached down, gripping the leather binding on Marin's right wrist, the secret she had guarded since the day she was found in the snow. With a violent jerk, he forced her arm upward for the court to see. "You are nothing but a vessel for our waste, Marin. A commoner's heart in a palace it does not deserve." The word Commonborn hit her like a physical blow, but as it left his lips, a low, tectonic hum vibrated through the floorboards. Beneath the leather, a heat began to scald her skin, not the burning of a wound, but the awakening of a sun. The binding began to smoke, a golden light bleeding through the cracks of the hide. Marin looked up, her eyes finally meeting Mordecai's, and for the first time in his life, the Lord felt the true meaning of terror. Something ancient was rattling the cage of her ribs, and it was no longer content to suffer in silence. If this story already has its grip on you, you belong here. Welcome to Judy's Romance Library. Subscribe so the truth of the bloodline finds you. Now, let us continue. Chapter 1. The Weight of Iron. The citadel of Aethelgard did not merely sit upon the mountain. It was a jagged tooth of granite gnawing at a bruised purple sky. Here, the wind didn't blow, it screamed, a relentless, haunting gale that carried the scent of wet stone and ancient, dormant pine. Inside the fortress, the air was different. It was heavy, stagnant with the smell of tallow candles, unwashed wool, and the metallic tang of the vessel link, the blood magic that bound the low-born to the high. Marin moved through the vaulted kitchens of the lower butteries with the silent, rhythmic grace of a shadow. Her footsteps made no sound on the damp rushes, a habit born of years spent trying to remain invisible. In Aethelgard, to be noticed was to be used, and Marin had already been used more than most. She was a vessel the lowest rung of the pack hierarchy. To the high wolves, she was not a woman, but a biological sponge. Through a ritual of tethered empathy performed at birth, Marin's nervous system was a mirror to the Alpha's daughter, the Lady Ilara. The weight of this burden was physical. As Marin reached for a heavy copper kettle, a sharp, searing heat bloomed across her left palm. She didn't drop the kettle. She didn't even flinch. She simply closed her eyes and breathed through the phantom burn. Somewhere in the upper solar, Ilara had likely tipped a candle or touched a hot tea service. The blister would form on Marin's skin, leaving Ilara's hand porcelain smooth and painless. "Still absorbing her whims, are you?" The voice was like gravel shifting under a heavy boot. Marin opened her eyes to see Hagar, the kitchen mistress, watching her with a mix of pity and disdain. Hagar was a beta-born who had lost her wolf to age, her face a map of deep-set wrinkles. "It is my purpose, Hagar," Marin replied. Her voice was low, a rare sound in the bustling kitchen. She spoke sparingly, for every word felt like a resource she needed to hoard. "Purpose," Hagar scoffed, throwing a blood-stained rag onto the table. "They've turned you into a ghost before you're even dead. You're 20 winters old, Marin. You should have a mate, a den, a life that isn't a hand-me-down from a pampered princess." Marin didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her work, scrubbing the iron pots until her knuckles were raw. Her one sanctuary was the wound of her own history, the blank space where her family should be. She remembered only a night of fire, the smell of burnt lavender, and the cold, calloused hand of the High Alpha as he dragged her from the snow. He hadn't saved her out of mercy. He had saved her because his daughter was a sickly infant, and he needed a vessel to ensure the true heir survived the winter. By mid-afternoon, the phantom pains had subsided to a dull ache. Maren was granted her 1 hour of rest, which in her world meant tending the Citadel's glass-enclosed garden. It was the only place in Ethelgard where life was nurtured rather than conquered. The garden was a marvel of medieval engineering, heated by volcanic vents deep within the mountain. While the world outside was a white wasteland, here the earth was dark and moist. Maren knelt in the dirt, her fingers sinking into the soil. This was her quiet strength. She didn't just plant seeds, she seemed to hear them. Under her touch, the winter lilies' stubborn, pale things that usually took months to sprout uncurled their petals in days. She never spoke of it. In a pack that valued the roar of the wolf and the bite of the sword, a girl who could talk to roots was either a freak or a threat. "The lilies are early this year." The voice made Maren's heart stumble. She didn't look up immediately, taking a moment to compose her features into the mask of iron dignity she wore for the nobility. Lord Mordecai stood at the entrance of the glass house. He was the Alpha's second, a man whose presence usually signaled judgment or war. His fur cloak was dusted with fresh snow, and the amber of his eyes seemed to catch the dying light of the afternoon sun. "They respond to the warmth, my lord," Maren said, finally standing. She kept her head bowed, but her spine remained perfectly straight. Mordecai stepped closer, the scent of cedar and cold air clinging to him. He was the only high-ranking wolf who ever spoke to her as if she were a person. In the quiet hours of the last moon, they had found themselves here often. He would speak of the politics of the North, the thinning bloodlines, the dying magic of the earth, and she would listen, offering short, meaningful insights that seemed to startle him. "The High Alpha is in a foul mood," Mordecai said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Council of Elders is pressing him. The pack's strength is failing, Maren. The wolves aren't shifting as easily as they once did. They are looking for someone to blame for the ancestors' silence." Maren looked at the leather binding on her right wrist. It felt tighter today, the skin beneath it itching with a strange, rhythmic heat. "And who have they chosen to blame?" Mordecai hesitated. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, before he caught himself and pulled back. The hierarchy was a wall of glass between them, invisible, but unbreakable. "They look at the Commonborn among us," Mordecai said, his jaw tightening. "They say the purity of the pack is being diluted by those we took in from the fringes. They say the vessels are draining the magic that belongs to the true bloods." "I do not take," Maren said, her voice steady. "I receive. I receive the pain Alara cannot carry. If that is a theft, then I am a very poor thief." "I know," Mordecai said softly, "but the law does not care for the truth of the heart. It only cares for the survival of the crown. Promise me, Maren. Tonight, during the great feast, stay in the shadows. Do not draw the Alpha's eye." "I am a vessel, my lord. My place is 3 paces behind the Lady Alara. The Alpha put me there. I cannot simply vanish." "Then be a shadow," Mordecai urged, his amber eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity she didn't fully understand. "Just for tonight. Something is shifting in the wind, Maren. I can smell the ozone. A storm is coming that won't be stayed by stone walls." He turned and left, his heavy boots echoing on the stone path. Maren remained in the garden as the sun dipped below the peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lilies. She touched her wrist, feeling the pulse beneath the leather. It wasn't just heat anymore. It was a drumbeat. She wasn't just a vessel for Alara's pain. She was a vessel for something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for the world to get cold enough and cruel enough to finally wake up. Chapter 2. The Feast of Thorns. The air in the great hall of Æthelgard was a suffocating soup of roasting boar, spilled ale, and the thick, musk-heavy scent of shifted wolves. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like predatory beasts against the tapestry-lined walls. To any outsider, it was a display of medieval splendor. To Maren, it was a gilded cage where the bars were made of tradition and the floor was littered with the bones of the weak. Maren stood in her designated place, 3 paces behind the high-backed oaken chair of Lady Alara. She was as still as the stone pillars surrounding her, her hands clasped in front of her coarse wool kirtle. Her lip, split by the High Alpha's hand only hours before, had begun to swell, a dull throb that she welcomed. It was a pain that belonged only to her, not a borrowed agony from the girl she served. Lady Alara, draped in shimmering silver silks that caught the torchlight, laughed at something a young lord whispered in her ear. She was beautiful in the way a winter frost is, beautiful, sharp, cold, and entirely fragile. Every time Alara reached for her goblet of wine, Maren felt the slight strain in her own shoulder. Every time Alara adjusted her heavy, jewel-encrusted collar, Maren felt the phantom weight pressing against her own throat. At the head of the table sat the High Alpha, a man who wore his cruelty like a mantle of state. His eyes, a predatory yellow, scanned the room with a restless hunger. Beside him sat the Council of Elders, ancient wolves whose spirits had long since curdled into bitterness. They whispered among themselves, their gazes frequently darting toward the lower end of the table where the Commonborn servants moved like ghosts. "My friends, my kin!" The High Alpha's voice boomed, cutting through the din of the feast. He rose, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the head table. "Tonight we do not merely feast. We secure the bloodline of Æthelgard. The winter has been long, and our ancestors demand a union of strength to break the frost." Maren felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the draft from the arrow slits. She saw Lord Mordecai stand. He looked magnificent in his black leather brigandine, his obsidian fur cloak pinned with a silver wolf head brooch. But as he stepped into the center of the hall, he did not look at the Alpha. He did not look at Alara. His eyes swept the shadows, finding Maren for a fraction of a second before he tore his gaze away. "Lord Mordecai," the Alpha declared, his voice dripping with a forced joviality that didn't reach his eyes. "You have served this pack as my second with iron and blood. It is time you served it with legacy. Step forward and claim your prize." Alara stood, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She moved toward Mordecai, her silk skirts hissing against the rushes. The hall held its breath. This was the moment of political necessity, the strongest commander joining the Alpha's bloodline to ensure the pack's dominance. Maren watched, her face a mask of perfect, terrifying calm. She remembered the garden. She remembered the way Mordecai's hand had brushed hers over the lilies, a touch that had felt like a promise. She remembered him telling her that the law was a blunt instrument. Now, she watched him become the hand that wielded it. "I accept the honor, Great Alpha," Mordecai said. His voice was steady, but to Maren's ears it sounded like the snapping of dry wood. He took Alara's hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. The cheers were deafening, but the Alpha raised a hand for silence. His yellow eyes settled on Maren. The transition from celebration to humiliation was instantaneous, a practiced shift in the atmosphere that Maren knew well. "However," the Alpha continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr, "a union of purity cannot be celebrated while the scent of the Commonborn pollutes the air of the high table. There are whispers, Mordecai, whispers that you have spent your nights in the glass house, speaking with a vessel as if she were a woman of rank." A gasp rippled through the hall. Alara stiffened, her eyes darting back to Maren with a sudden, sharp venom. Mordecai remained frozen, his hand still holding Alara's. "She is a servant, my lord," Mordecai said, his voice tight. "A vessel for your daughter's health, nothing more." "Is she?" The Alpha walked down from the dais, his boots heavy on the stone. He stopped in front of Marin. He was a foot taller than her, his presence a crushing weight of alpha aura designed to make the lower-ranked collapse. Marin did not collapse. She did not even lower her gaze. "You," the Alpha spat, reaching out to grip her chin with calloused fingers. "You think because you carry the lady's pain, you carry her worth? You are a common-born stray. A dog brought in from the cold to soak up the filth we do not wish to touch." He turned back to the room, mocking her. "Look at her, standing there with the silence of a queen. Tell us, girl, did you think a lord would ever choose a common-born over a true blood?" Marin spoke then, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the hall. "A lord chooses what his heart allows, a king chooses what his fear demands." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hiss in shock. The Alpha's face turned a mottled purple. He backhanded her not a playful cuff, but a strike fueled by the full weight of his shifted strength. Marin was thrown back against the stone pillar, her head cracked against the granite, and for a moment, the world turned into a swirl of gray and red. She tasted blood real, metallic, hot blood. "Common-born filth!" the Alpha roared. "You dare speak of fear to me?" He grabbed her right arm, the one wrapped in the thick leather binding. "You hide your arm as if it holds gold, but we all know what lies beneath. The mark of a peasant, the scar of a nameless bloodline." He began to rip at the leather. Marin felt the first true spark of panic, not for her life, but for the secret. "No," she whispered, her first break in her stoic facade. "Yes," the Alpha sneered. He signaled to the guards. "Hold her. Let the court see the nobility she hides. Let Lord Mordecai see exactly what he was dallying with in the dirt." 2 guards seized Marin's shoulders, pinning her against the pillar. Mordecai took a step forward, his hand going to the hilt of his sword, but Alara clutched his arm, her eyes wide with a cruel curiosity. He stopped. He watched. The Alpha pulled a small, jagged skinning knife from his belt. "If the leather won't come off, I'll take the skin with it." As the blade touched the old, scorched leather, the common-born slur echoed through the hall once more, shouted by the drunken elders. "Commonborn! Commonborn!" Then the world changed. A low hum, like the sound of 1,000 bees, began to vibrate through the stone of the citadel. The leather under the Alpha's knife didn't cut it, began to glow. A white-hot heat radiated from Marin's wrist, so intense that the Alpha cried out and dropped his knife. The leather binding didn't just break. It shattered into fine, golden ash. From the skin of Marin's wrist, a brilliant, geometric seal erupted. It was a sun, its rays turning into interlocking vines of light that raced up her forearm. The light was so bright it blinded the front row of the council. Marin stood tall, her eyes closed, her breath coming in slow, rhythmic gasps. The pain was gone. The borrowed empathy was severed. For the first time in 15 years, she felt only herself. "What is this?" the Alpha hissed, shielding his eyes. "What sorcery is this?" Marin opened her eyes. They were no longer the dull gray of a servant. They were gold, the deep, ancient gold of a sun that had finally decided to rise. She looked at Mordecai, who stood paralyzed by the light. "It is not sorcery," Marin said, her voice sounding like the tolling of a great iron bell. "It is a reckoning." The Alpha lunged for her, but a shockwave of heat threw him back 5 paces. Marin did not run. She simply stood in the center of the hall, the solar seal on her arm pulsing like a living heart. The common-born girl was gone. In her place stood something that made the wolves of Aethelgard feel, for the very first time, like prey. Chapter 3. The Silence of the Woods. The great hall was a cacophony of retreating footsteps and frantic prayers, but Maren heard none of it. She walked through the heavy oak doors, her pace measured, her back unbowed. The guards, men who had shoved her into walls and laughed at her bruised knees for years, scrambled backward as if she were a flame in a room full of dry straw. They did not try to stop her. The light from her wrist, no longer a blinding flare, but a steady, rhythmic gold, cast long, defiant shadows against the stone corridors. She did not stop until the air turned sharp, and the smell of ancient pine replaced the stench of the citadel. The north woods were a cathedral of frost, where the trees stood like skeletal giants draped in white velvet. Maren moved deep into the thicket, her boots crunching on the frozen crust of the snow. She found the ancient grove a circle of silver birches that seemed to lean toward the center as if guarding a secret. Here, finally, she allowed herself to stop. She sat upon a fallen log, the cold seeping through her thin wool kirtle, but she did not shiver. The heat in her arm was a hearth fire, warming her marrow. She did not weep. To weep was to acknowledge that the High Alpha's blows had broken something inside her, and Maren refused to give him that victory. Instead, she took a handful of pristine snow and pressed it to her split lip. The sting was sharp, grounding her in the reality of the physical world. She watched the droplets of blood fall into the white powder, crimson flowers blooming in the ice. She looked at her wrist. The skin was smooth, the scars of the old leather binding gone as if they had never been. The seal was an intricate web of lines, more elegant than any jewelry the Lady Alara possessed. It felt alive. It hummed against her pulse, a low, tectonic vibration that seemed to connect her to the very roots of the mountain. "I knew you would be here." The voice was a low rasp, heavy with the weight of the night's betrayals. Mordecai stood at the entrance of the grove. He looked smaller than he had in the hall, the finery of his obsidian cloak dusted with snow. He didn't approach. He stood at the edge of the birch circle, as if he no longer had the right to stand in her presence. Maren did not look up. She continued to press the snow to her lip. "The celebration must be over early, my lord. I expected the music to last until dawn." "There is no music tonight," Mordecai said, his voice trembling. "The Alpha is in a rage. He has ordered the archives searched. He is calling it a trick of the forbidden arts, a curse meant to destabilize the pack." "The truth is always a curse to those who live on lies," Maren replied quietly. She finally turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes, still flecked with that unnatural gold, seemed to pierce through the shadows of his hood. "And what do you call it, Mordecai? You, who held the hand of the heir while the Commonborn was bled." Mordecai flinched as if she had struck him. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand reaching out instinctively before he caught himself. "I have a duty, Maren. Ethelgard is failing. The winters are growing longer. The wolves are losing their shift. If I had stood for you, if I had claimed a vessel over the Alpha's daughter, it would have been the end of the pack. There would be civil war by morning." "And so you chose the peace of the grave," Maren said. Her voice carried no anger, only a devastating hollow calm. "You chose the law over the life that stood beside you in the garden." "Do not speak to me of duty, my lord. You speak of fear. You were afraid to lose your status. You were afraid to be common like me." "It isn't that simple," he snapped, his frustration finally breaking through. "I am a commander. My life belongs to the safety of these people. I thought if I married Alara, I could protect you. I could keep you in the glass house, away from the Alpha's whims. I was trying to save you." Maren stood up. She was a head shorter than him, but in the silence of the woods, she felt like the taller of the two. "You wanted to keep me as a pet. A secret to be visited in the dark when the weight of your duty became too much. You didn't want to save me, Mordecai. You wanted to own a piece of the light without ever having to stand in the sun." She walked toward him, and for the first time in his life, the great commander of Aethelgard retreated. "The seal on my arm is not a trick," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a scream. "It is the solar seal of the first sovereign. Your High Alpha is a steward who stayed too long in a house that does not belong to him. He knows it. That is why he struck me. That is why he hates me. Because my very existence proves that his power is a theft." "Maren, listen to me," Mordecai urged, his eyes frantic. "The Alpha is calling for the Iron Guard. He won't let you stay here. He can't. If the people see you, if they see that mark, the hierarchy will collapse. He will kill you to preserve the order. Please, I have a horse at the western gate. Take it. Run to the southern lands. I will tell them I lost your trail." Maren looked at the trees, then back at the man who had been her only friend. "You want me to run so you can keep your conscience clean. You want me to vanish so you don't have to look at the throne and remember what you traded for it." She shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her bruised lips. "I have spent 20 years in silence, Mordecai. I have endured the pain of a daughter that was not mine. I have slept in the damp and eaten the scraps of those who called me filth. I have already survived the worst you and your Alpha could offer. Maren, please, go back to your bride, Lord Mordecai," she said, turning her back on him. She knelt again in the snow, her fingers brushing the frozen earth. "Go back to the halls of stone. The woods are older than your laws. They do not care for your titles, and neither do I." Mordecai stood there for a long moment, the silence of the grove pressing in on him. He looked like a man who wanted to say 1,000 things, but the weight of his obsidian cloak was too heavy. Finally, he turned and vanished into the darkness. Maren remained. She felt the earth beneath her palms, and for the first time, she didn't just feel the cold. She felt the heartbeat of the mountain. It was slow, sluggish, like a beast in a deep slumber. The solar seal on her wrist began to pulse in time with that heartbeat. She wasn't a commoner. She wasn't a servant. She was the blood of the mountain, and she realized then that she hadn't come to the woods to hide. She had come to wake the earth up. Chapter 4. The Trial of Blood. The peace of the silver birch grove was a fragile illusion, shattered not by the wind, but by the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the Iron Guard. They did not come with the honor of a challenge. They came with the cowardice of numbers. 20 high-ranking wolves, their faces obscured by steel helms, fanned out through the trees. They carried nets woven with crushed silver, a cruel medieval invention designed to sear the skin of anyone with a drop of ancient magic in their veins. Maren stood as the first net whistled through the freezing air. She did not run. She did not scream. As the silver mesh draped over her shoulders, the metal hissed against her skin, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the moonlight. The pain was astronomical, 1,000 white-hot needles stitching into her flesh, yet she remained upright. Her dignity was a fortress that even the Alpha's silver could not breach. "The girl who would be queen," the lead guard mocked, his voice muffled by his visor. "Let us see how your divine blood tastes when it hits the dirt." They hauled her back to the citadel, not through the servants' entrance, but through the main gates, parading her like a captured beast. The pack members who had seen her light in the hall now peered from their windows with eyes full of a terrifying, silent hunger. Fear had turned to superstition, and superstition had turned to a demand for blood. The High Alpha waited in the courtyard, standing before the ancient world tree, a massive, gnarled oak that had stood since the founding of Aethelgard. Its branches were bare, its bark blackened by a century of rot that no one dared acknowledge. "The wells are dry, vessel," the Alpha roared, his voice echoing off the stone ramparts. "The mountain has closed its heart to us because of your presence. The council has spoken. To cleanse the pack of your Commonborn corruption, a sacrifice of blood is required. Not just any blood, but the blood that carries the false seal." Maren was forced onto her knees before the tree, Her kirtle was charred from the silver nets, her skin raw and weeping, but she looked up at the alpha with a gaze that made him hesitate for a heartbeat. "You blame the girl for the drought," Marin said, her voice steady despite the agony. "But it is your greed that has choked the springs. You have taken and taken, never giving back to the earth, until the mountain has nothing left to offer but dust." "Silence!" the alpha bellowed, signaling the guards to bind her to the roots. "You speak of the earth as if you are its daughter. Tomorrow, at dawn, we shall see. If your blood is truly divine, perhaps the tree will bloom. If you are the fraud I know you to be, you will simply be the fertilizer that saves our winter." Mordecai stood in the shadows of the archway, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked at Marin, her face pale, her hair matted with frost and blood, and for a moment the mask of the great commander slipped. He took a single step forward, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the alpha's yellow eyes snapped toward him. "Is there a problem, Lord Mordecai?" the alpha asked, his voice a low threat. "Or are you still mourning the loss of your kitchen wench?" Mordecai looked at the ground. He looked at the heavy obsidian signet on his finger. "No, my lord," he whispered. "The law must be satisfied." Marin watched him, and in that moment, her last connection to her old life severed. The man she had loved was a ghost of a person, a shell filled with the dust of institutional necessity. She turned her eyes back to the tree. As the guards retreated, leaving her bound to the rotting oak in the center of the freezing courtyard, the silence of the citadel settled over her like a shroud. The moon climbed high, casting long, skeletal shadows across her lap. She felt the seal on her wrist beginning to thrum, not with the heat of the hall, but with a deep, mournful resonance. It was calling to the tree. It was calling to the water locked deep beneath the stone. She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against the rough, cold bark. "I am here," she whispered in the silence of her mind. "I am the vessel. If you need blood to wake, take mine. But do not let them starve in the dark." The wind picked up, howling through the battlements, carrying the scent of ozone and the coming storm. The trial of blood had begun, but it was not Marin who was on trial. It was the heart of Aethelgard itself. If her journey moved something in you, you belong among the seekers. Subscribe so the rise of the sovereign finds you. Welcome to Judy's romance library. Now, the moon rises over the sacrifice. Chapter 5. The Shifting Hearth. The hours between midnight and dawn were the coldest Aethelgard had known in a century. The frost grew thick upon the stones of the courtyard, turning the world into a landscape of jagged glass. Marin remained bound to the world tree, her breath coming in shallow, translucent puffs. The silver nets had left deep, angry welts across her arms and chest, but the solar seal on her wrist acted as a rhythmic pulse of warmth, keeping her heart beating when the very air sought to still it. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the northern cloaks. It moved with a predator's grace, but there was a heaviness to the footfalls that betrayed a soul in turmoil. Mordecai knelt in the frost before her. He carried no weapon, only a small, hooded lantern that threw a flickering amber glow over Marin's battered form. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the sight of her dignity amidst the ruin of her clothes seemed to wound him more than any blade. "I have the keys," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The guards are unconscious. I used the poppy wine from the infirmary." Marin opened her eyes slowly. The gold in her irises was faint now, like the last embers of a dying fire. "You are late, Mordecai. The moon is already setting." "Marin, listen to me," he said, reaching out to touch the ropes that bound her, then pulling back when he saw the silver burns on her skin. "I can get you to the tunnels. They lead to the lower valley. From there, you can cross the border into the Sunlands. They will recognize that mark. They will protect you." "And what of you?" Marin asked. Her voice was thin, but it carried the weight of a mountain. I will stay. I will tell the Alpha you used your sorcery to escape. He will strip me of my title, perhaps exile me. It is a small price to pay for your life." Maren looked at the man who had been her world. She saw the lines of exhaustion on his face, the genuine terror in his eyes. He was offering her mercy, but it was a mercy born of guilt, not of justice. "You still do not understand," Maren said, her head resting back against the rotting oak. "If I run, I prove him right. I prove that the Commonborn are cowards who flee when the winter bites. I prove that this seal is a curse rather than a gift." "Maren, he is going to kill you," Mordecai hissed, his hands finally gripping the ropes. "The obsidian blade is already being sharpened. The council wants a spectacle. They want to show the pack that no amount of ancient blood can defy the Alpha's law." "The Alpha's law is a flickering candle," Maren replied. "The mountain's law is the sun. One is about to go out, Mordecai. The other is about to rise." She leaned forward, as much as her bonds would allow, her eyes locking onto his. "Why do you stay, Mordecai? Why do you serve a man who would murder a girl to hide his own failure? Is the obsidian cloak so warm that it has frozen your heart?" Mordecai flinched. He looked at the high windows of the citadel, where the Alpha's torches still burned. I believed in the order. I believed that without the hierarchy, we would be nothing but animals in the woods. I thought the tradition was what kept us alive." "Tradition is the memory of greatness," Maren said softly. "But when the greatness is gone, tradition is just a cage. You are a good man, Mordecai. But a good man who follows a wicked law is simply a silent accomplice." He looked at his hands, then back at her. For the first time, the hesitation in his eyes began to shift into something else, a crack in the foundation of his loyalty. He didn't untie her, but he didn't leave. He sat in the frost beside her, the lantern between them. "I will not beg for my life," Maren said, closing her eyes again. "And I will not run. If this pack is to survive, it must see what happens when the vessel is finally full." "It's already shifting," Mordecai whispered, looking at the ground. "The frost. It's melting, Maren. Look." Around the base of the world tree, where Maren's feet touched the earth, the ice had vanished. A circle of dark, moist soil had appeared in the middle of the frozen courtyard. Small, pale green shoots were already pushing through the dirt, despite the sub-zero air. The power structure of Aethelgard was cracking, not from a sword's blow, but from the quiet, unstoppable force of life returning to where it had been denied. Mordecai stayed there until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the eastern peaks, watching the girl who refused to be a victim and the tree that was beginning to breathe again. Chapter 6. The Golden Fracture. The dawn did not break with the soft pinks of a spring morning. Instead, the sky over Aethelgard bled a bruised, violent purple, as if the heavens themselves were a wound that refused to close. A thin, unnatural mist clung to the cobblestones of the courtyard, swirling around the roots of the world tree. The High Alpha emerged from the citadel, flanked by the Council of Elders. He was dressed in ritualistic furs, his chest bared to the biting wind, carrying the obsidian sacrificial blade. Mordecai stood to the side, his face a mask of hollow stone. He had remained in the courtyard until the guards returned to their posts, and now he stood as the loyal second, though his hand rested with white-knuckled intensity on the hilt of his sword. "The hour is come," the Alpha's voice boomed, amplified by the stone walls. "The sun rises, and with it, the corruption of the Commonborn shall be excised from our soil." Two guards stepped forward, unbinding Maren from the tree only to force her toward the heavy stone altar that sat at the oak's base. Maren's legs were stiff, her skin mapped with the silver burns of the previous night, but she walked with a terrifying, silent poise. She did not struggle. She did not beg. Her calm was so absolute that a ripple of unease passed through the gathered pack members. You speak of corruption, Marin said, her voice cutting through the wind. She was placed upon the stone, her head tilted back to look at the dying branches above her. But look at your tree, Alpha. Look at the land you claim to rule. It is not my blood that has turned the water to dust. It is the rot in your own heart. Silence the wench, one of the elders hissed, his voice like dry leaves. She uses the tongue of the forbidden ones to bewitch our senses. The Alpha stepped onto the dais, looming over her. He raised the obsidian blade high, the volcanic glass catching the first gray light of the sun. By the laws of the first pack, by the blood of the mountain, I reclaim our strength. He brought the blade down with a roar of exertion, aiming for the center of Marin's chest. But the obsidian never touched her skin. 2 inches from her heart, the blade struck an invisible wall of heat. The sound was not a thud, but a high-pitched, crystalline crack. The obsidian, the strongest substance known to the pack, shattered. Shards of black glass flew into the air, suspended in a shimmering field of amber light. The Alpha recoiled, his hand scorched by the sudden eruption of energy. What is this? Guards, seize her! The Iron Guard rushed forward, but as they stepped into the circle of the World Tree, the ground groaned. A deep, tectonic vibration shook the citadel to its very foundations. The Commonborn slur was shouted one last time by a fearful elder, and that word, that final insult, was the spark that blew the forge wide. The solar seal on Marin's wrist didn't just glow, it fractured. The golden light tore through the remaining threads of her scorched sleeve, racing up her neck and down her legs until she was encased in a suit of liquid sun. The light was so intense that the mist in the courtyard evaporated instantly, and the shadows of the guards were burned into the stone walls behind them. Marin rose. She did not stand. She drifted upward until her feet were inches above the sacrificial altar. Her hair, once matted and dark, now fanned out around her head like a halo of golden silk. The cycle is broken, Marin said. Her voice was no longer that of a servant girl. It was a choir of 1,000 voices, ancient and resonant. Beneath her, the World Tree reacted. The black rot on its bark began to flake away, falling like soot to the ground. From the tips of its skeletal branches, buds appeared, not the small, green buds of a normal oak, but glowing, golden leaves that unfurled with the sound of chiming bells. Sorcery! The Alpha screamed, his face contorted in terror. He lunged for a fallen spear, but Marin merely looked at him. The air in the courtyard grew heavy, the pressure so great that the wolves of the council were forced to their knees. Their inner wolves, the primal spirits they so prided themselves on, whimpered in the presence of a sovereign they hadn't seen in 500 years. Mordecai watched, his breath caught in his throat. He saw the girl he had tried to save transform into the power that would save them all. The solar seal was not a mark of rank. It was a key to the earth itself. The stone of the courtyard began to split. From the fissures, water erupted, not a flood, but a rhythmic pulsing of crystal-clear springs, rising from the deep veins of the mountain that had been choked by the Alpha's greed. The wells were filling. The drought was over. Marin turned her gaze to the High Alpha. He was cowering now, the true heir Alara hiding behind a pillar, her silks ruined by the spray of the returning water. You called me a vessel, Marin said, her golden eyes burning through the Alpha's soul. And you were right. I am the vessel for every winter you let the people starve. I am the vessel for every blow you struck against those who could not fight back. And today, the vessel overflows. With a flick of her wrist, the golden light expanded in a massive, silent shockwave. It didn't destroy the stone, but it stripped away the banners of the Alpha's house, turning the silver and blue cloth to gray dust. The hierarchy of Aethelgard was not just challenged, it was erased. The golden fracture was complete. The hidden power had awakened, and as Marin descended back to the earth, The people of the pack didn't look at her with hunger or hate. They looked at her with the wide-eyed realization that the sun had finally returned to the north, and it had a woman's face. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Arrives. The courtyard of Aethelgard was no longer a place of execution. It had become a cathedral of living light. The golden leaves of the world tree vibrated with a low, choral hum that seemed to resonate in the very marrow of every wolf present. Maren descended slowly, her bare feet touching the dark, moist earth that had replaced the frost. The liquid gold of the solar seal pulsed rhythmically upon her skin, a visual heartbeat of the mountain's restored life. The High Alpha, once a figure of absolute terror, scrambled backward on his hands and knees. His fine furs were soaked with the spray of the returning springs, and his crown of silver wolf teeth had fallen into the mud. He looked up at Maren, his yellow eyes wide with the frantic, cornered look of a beast that realized the trap had finally snapped shut. You cannot do this," he wheezed, his voice stripped of its command. "The pack law, the blood sovereignty. It is mine by right of conquest. The council recognized me." Maren walked toward him, each step causing the ground to ripple with soft, green growth. "The council recognized your strength because they were afraid of the silence of the earth. You did not lead, Alpha. You occupied. You held a throne that was never yours, and you fed on the fear of those you were meant to protect." She stopped a mere foot away from him. The air around her shimmered with heat, making the Alpha's skin bead with sweat despite the mountain chill. "Guards!" the Alpha shrieked, looking toward the Iron Guard. "Kill her! She is a pretender, a witch wearing the face of a servant." The Iron Guard moved, their instincts honed by years of brutal training. They raised their spears, the steel tips glinting in the unnatural golden light. But as they stepped toward Maren, their knees buckled. It wasn't a magical strike that felled them. It was their own inner wolves. The spirits within them, the primal essence of the pack, recognized the sovereign. They would not, could not strike the source of their own life. One by one, the elite warriors of Aethelgard dropped their weapons, the iron clattering harmlessly against the stones. They bowed their heads, exposing their necks in a gesture of absolute submission. "The law of the blade is over," Maren said, her voice echoing off the high stone battlements. She turned her gaze toward the Council of Elders. These were the men who had signed the decrees of her suffering, the men who had laughed as she absorbed the Lady Alara's fevers. They cowered behind their heavy oak table, their faces pale and wrinkled like rotting fruit. "And you," Maren said, her eyes burning like twin suns, "you who traded the truth for the comfort of a warm hearth. You who watched a child bleed and called it tradition. Your wisdom is nothing but a shroud for your cowardice." One elder, bolder or perhaps more desperate than the rest, stood up. "The lineage was broken. We did what was necessary to survive. Without the Alpha, we would have been slaughtered by the southern packs." "You were already being slaughtered," Maren countered, her dignity as sharp as any sword. "You were being slaughtered by the cold, by the hunger, and by the rot of your own souls. You chose a tyrant because you were too weak to choose the truth." She turned back to the Alpha. He had found a discarded dagger and, in a final act of madness, lunged for her throat. The movement was slow to Maren's eyes. She didn't flinch. She simply raised her hand. The solar seal flared, a blinding burst of white gold light that struck the Alpha's chest. It didn't burn his flesh, but it did something far more devastating to a wolf of his rank. It stripped away his aura. The invisible weight of his command, the stolen power he had used to cow the pack, evaporated into the air like mist. He collapsed, his hair turning shock white in a matter of seconds. He was no longer a High Alpha. He was just an old man, broken and hollowed by the weight of his own cruelty. Mordecai stepped forward then. He had watched the entire reckoning from the shadows, his sword still sheathed. He looked at the ruined Alpha, then at the council, and finally at Marin. The mask of the commander was gone. In its place was a man who was seeing the sun for the first time. "Marin," he whispered, his voice thick with 1,000 regrets. She looked at him, and for a moment, the golden fire in her eyes softened. "The second of Aethelgard," she said quietly. "The man who knew the lilies could bloom in the ice, yet chose to let the frost take them." Mordecai knelt. He didn't do it because his wolf forced him. He did it because his heart demanded it. He unpinned the obsidian cloak from his shoulders, the symbol of his rank and his complicity, and laid it in the mud at her feet. "I am nothing," he said, his head bowed. "I have no right to stand before you. I have no right to the heir you have returned to us." Marin looked down at the cloak. "You have the right to the truth, Mordecai. That is the only thing I will give you today. You chose the law. Now, you must live with the consequences of a law that no longer exists." The Lady Alara emerged from behind the pillars, her silk dress stained and her eyes red with weeping. She looked at Marin, the girl who had taken her pain for 15 years, and for the first time, she saw the person behind the vessel. "What will you do to us?" Alara asked, her voice trembling. "Will you burn the citadel? Will you scatter us to the winds?" Marin looked around at the gathered pack, the hungry mothers, the scarred warriors, the children who had never known a spring. She saw the fear in their eyes, the expectation of a new cycle of violence. "I am not a conqueror," Marin declared, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the wind. "I am the sovereign of the Sunkin. My reign does not begin with the edge of a blade, but with the opening of a hand. The citadel shall stand, but its gates shall never again be locked against its own people." She reached out and touched the world tree. A final pulse of golden light surged through the bark, and the tree exploded into full, magnificent bloom. The scent of lavender and ancient earth filled the courtyard, washing away the smell of ozone and blood. The reckoning was over. The institutional cruelty that had defined Aethelgard for a century had been dismantled not by war, but by the simple, unstoppable rise of a woman who refused to be broken. Marin stood in the center of the bloom, her dignity restored, her power earned, and her world permanently changed. Chapter 8. The sun rises on ash. The smoke from the shattered obsidian blade had long since cleared, replaced by the intoxicating, heavy scent of the world tree's golden blossoms. Aethelgard was no longer a fortress of jagged silence. It was a hive of frantic, hushed movement. The transition of power was not a bloody coup, but a structural collapse of a hollow house. Without the Alpha's stolen aura to enforce his will, the hierarchy that had oppressed the Commonborn for generations simply ceased to function. Marin sat not on the high throne of the great hall, but on the edge of the stone fountain in the center of the courtyard. The water bubbled with a rhythmic, musical clarity, cooling the air. She had refused the silks offered by the trembling handmaidens, choosing instead a simple kirtle of undyed wool. Her only adornment was the solar seal, which had settled into a faint, elegant tracing of gold upon her skin, shimmering only when she drew a deep breath. She watched as the people, the real people of Aethelgard, emerged from the shadows. They came tentatively at first, touching the green moss growing between the paving stones as if they expected it to vanish. Mothers brought their sickly children to the springs, and as the water touched their parched lips, the gray pallor of the long winter began to lift. "It will take time," a voice said from the archway. Mordecai stood there. He had traded his commander's armor for the simple tunics of a traveler. He looked older, the lines around his amber eyes deepened by a fatigue that sleep would not fix. He carried a small pack over one shoulder and a weathered staff in his hand. "The soil is waking," Marin replied, not looking up. "The mountain has a long memory, Mordecai. It knows how to heal if we stop poisoning the roots." Mordecai stepped into the light of the courtyard, stopping several paces away. The distance between them was no longer one of rank, but of history. The council has fled. Those who remained are waiting for your command. They expect a new set of laws. They expect a queen. Marin finally looked at him. Her eyes were calm, devoid of the vengeful fire that had consumed the Alpha. I did not break their chains just to forge them in gold, Mordecai. If they want a queen to tell them when to breathe and when to bleed, they have learned nothing from their suffering. They are lost, Mordecai argued softly. They have lived under the iron for so long they do not know how to stand without the weight of it. Then they shall learn to lean on one another, Marin said. She stood up, her movements fluid and regal without effort. I will stay until the first harvest. I will teach the healers how to use the sun-kin herbs that are returning to the valley. I will show the builders how to open the walls to let the light in. But I will not be their Alpha. Mordecai looked at the world tree, its golden leaves shimmering in the afternoon breeze. And what of the Alpha? He sits in the shadows of the lower butteries, babbling about the dark. The people want his head. Death is a mercy he has not earned, Marin said, her voice turning cold for the first time. He shall live to see the world he tried to kill bloom without him. He shall be a servant in the kitchens he once looked down upon. He shall know what it is to be Commonborn in a world that no longer values his name. The justice of it was quiet and absolute. It was a medieval reckoning not of the axe, but of the soul. Mordecai shifted his pack. The western borders are still thin. There are rogue packs that will try to test our strength now that the High Wolf has fallen. I have spoken to the scouts. I will take a small group. We will patrol the perimeter, not as lords, but as watchers. We will ensure no one disturbs the peace of the valley while the gardens grow. Marin looked at him, searching his face. She saw the man who had loved her in the garden, and she saw the man who had betrayed her in the hall. You seek exile, Mordecai. You seek a way to pay for a debt that cannot be settled with service. I seek a way to look at the sun without flinching, he admitted, his voice a low rasp. Marin reached out, her fingers brushing the air between them. For a moment, a spark of the old warmth flared, a memory of lilies and shared silence. Go then, guard the borders. But do not do it for me. Do it for the girl you saw in the snow 20 years ago, and for every girl like her who is currently hiding in the dark. Protect the vulnerable, Mordecai. That is the only law that matters now. He bowed a deep, agonizingly slow bow of a man who finally understood the weight of true sovereignty. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the great gates, leaving the citadel behind. As the sun began to set, casting a long golden glow over the mountain, Marin walked back to her garden. The glass house was no longer necessary. The air was warm enough now for the lilies to survive under the open sky. She knelt in the dirt, her hands sinking into the dark, fragrant earth. She was no longer a vessel. She was no longer a secret. She was the anchor of a new world, a world where dignity was the highest currency and the truth was the only crown. As the first stars appeared, she felt the mountains settle into a peaceful, rhythmic pulse. The silent vessel had overflowed, and the land was finally whole. And so he knelt before the woman he once called worthless. If her journey moved something in you, share this with someone who believes that dignity always finds its way home. Subscribe to Judy's Romance Library so the next episode never passes you by. Until we meet again, this has been Judy's Romance Library.